She was a widow, all alone on the vast, unforgiving plains of Montana, and she was about to lose everything. The man she'd just saved from freezing to death in her own barn was her only hope. Or so she thought. But this man, this quiet stranger with storm-gray eyes, was hiding a secret so big it would burn her entire world to the ground. And the truth was far, far worse than anything she could ever imagine. Some nights the loneliness cuts deeper than the Montana winter wind. Eliza May Barnes knew this pain like the back of her own calloused hand. She worked her small homestead alone, her husband Thomas's grave still a fresh mound under a blanket of new snow. The year was 1887, and the world felt empty, cold, and silent, until the morning she found him. She'd been checking the animals before dawn, her breath pluming in the bitter air. The barn door creaked open, fighting the wind, and there he was, a tall man, collapsed against the wall, his dark coat crusted with ice, his face as pale as a death shroud. For a second, her heart stopped. She thought he was gone, but then she saw it, the faint, shallow rise and fall of his chest. Common sense screamed at her. A woman alone had to be careful. Desperate men did desperate things in the dead of winter. But something about the way his hands were folded peacefully across his chest, it reminded her of Thomas in his final moments. She couldn't just leave him to die. Getting him inside was a battle. He was a big man, solid as an oak, and dragging his dead weight through the snow made her muscles scream in protest. She pulled off his frozen boots and coat, wrapped him in every quilt she owned, and spooned warm broth between his blue lips until slowly life began to seep back into him. He woke like a man surfacing from a deep, dark river. His eyes, when they finally opened, were the color of a summer storm, gray with flecks of blue that seemed to shift and swirl with some hidden thought. He tried to speak, but she just hushed him. "Rest now," she'd said. "There's time for talking later." That was 4 days ago. He'd given his name as Mr. Gray, and nothing more. He was a man of few words, content to chop wood with a steady, powerful rhythm, and to sit by her fire in the evenings, saying nothing at all. There was a peacefulness to him, a quiet strength that settled over her little cabin like a warm blanket. He moved through her world without disrupting it. He fixed a loose board on the porch without being asked. He gentled her nervous milk cow, Bessie, with a touch that spoke of long experience. But it was the way he listened that truly struck her. When she found herself talking, the words spilling out of her after months of silence, he gave her his complete attention. She told him about Thomas, about their dreams for this land, about her fears for the future. He just watched her, his gray eyes seeming to understand everything she didn't say. "Thomas always said this land would test us," she told him one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "He said it would ask us what we were really made of." Mr. Gray looked up from the harness he was mending, another of Thomas's tools that had lain neglected. "And what did you tell it?" The question caught her off guard. Most people offered pity. He offered a challenge. "I told it I was made of stubbornness and grief," she answered after a long moment. "I'm not sure that's enough." He smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen. It changed his entire face. "Stubbornness built most of the West, Mrs. Barnes. Grief just means you love something worth fighting for." A warmth spread through her chest, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her, like she was more than just a problem to be solved. Her neighbors, the Hendersons, meant well, but their visits were filled with worried glances and casseroles. James Miller from the general store just wanted to buy her land cheap. "This country is too hard for a woman alone," he'd said, his voice slick with false concern. But this stranger, Mr. Gray, he seemed to see her, the real her. The next day she found him standing by the wooden stakes Thomas had driven into the ground, marking the spot where they'd planned to plant an apple orchard. "Apple trees?" he asked as she joined him. "Thomas's idea," she said, a lump forming in her throat. "For the shade, for the children we planned on having." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, a confession of a future that would never be. Mr. Gray didn't offer empty comforts. He just nodded, his gaze scanning the lay of the land. Good soil for it, protected from the north wind, plenty of morning sun. He had a good eye. And just like that, he made Thomas's dream feel real again. Not the foolish hope of a man who died too young, but a smart plan from a man who understood the land. She stood there in the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, feeling a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost knocked her off her feet. That night she showed him the photograph. The little tin type of Thomas, standing proud beside their first garden, his face bright with hope. He was a good man, she said, tracing the image with her finger. Mr. Gray studied the photograph with a strange intensity. He looks happy. He was. He believed we could make it work. She looked up, meeting those stormy eyes. Sometimes I think he was the only one who did. Now, I don't know what I believe anymore. The wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth. Belief is a luxury when you're just trying to survive, he said, his voice a low rumble. But if you survive long enough, sometimes belief comes back on its own. There was something in the way he spoke. A weight, a wisdom that didn't belong to a common drifter. It made her curious. It made her wonder. And it made her afraid. Because for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. And that feeling, she was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous thing of all. This quiet stranger was waking up parts of her heart she thought had been buried with Thomas, and she had no idea who he really was. The fifth morning brought a cold so sharp it felt like breathing broken glass. Eliza woke before dawn to find ice feathering the inside of her windows. Mr. Gray was already up, stoking the fire, moving with a quiet grace that was becoming achingly familiar. As he worked, his coat fell open. She saw the glint of something gold, a heavy, ornate watch chain, the kind no ordinary hired hand could ever afford. When he pulled out the watch itself to check the time, it gleamed in the firelight, a masterpiece of expensive craftsmanship. She squeezed her eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, but her mind was racing. Who was he? The question gnawed at her all through morning chores. He was good with the animals, his hands gentle but firm. Animals know when someone understands them, he said, smiling that rare, real smile. They respond to confidence and kindness. More honest than most people, in my experience. They worked in a comfortable rhythm, but now she noticed things. The clean, well-kept nails on his calloused hands, the precise, educated grammar when he spoke, the quality of the wool in his worn coat. Nothing added up. Over breakfast, he asked her about Thomas. How did you two meet? She found herself telling him about the church social, about how Thomas had stepped on her feet during their first dance. He had this way of making everything seem possible, she said, a sad smile touching her lips. Sounds like a good man to build a life with. He was, she said. I used to think I knew what love was supposed to look like. Steady, predictable, safe. Used to think? He pressed, his gray eyes missing nothing. I don't know what I think anymore. He nodded slowly. Grief changes the landscape of the heart. Did you ever lose someone? The question was out before she could stop it, a clumsy intrusion into his private world. He didn't flinch. I lost the woman I thought I'd marry, he said, his voice flat. Though not to death. She decided she preferred someone with better prospects. A bitter smile touched his lips. Turned out she was right to leave. I wasn't the man she thought I was. Then she was a fool, Eliza said, a surge of protective anger surprising her. Was she? I let her believe things about me that weren't true. When she found out who I really was, she realized she'd fallen in love with a lie. He met Eliza's gaze, and the look in his eyes sent a shiver down her spine. Sometimes we become so afraid of being rejected for who we are that we forget to be ourselves at all. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Do you ever think about settling down again? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, and the intensity of his gaze made her pulse hammer in her throat. I'm beginning to think, he said slowly, that I never knew what settling down really meant before. The silence in the small cabin was suddenly electric. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floorboards. I should check the root cellar. As she moved past him, he caught her hand. His touch was warm, strong, and sent a jolt through her that was entirely unexpected. Eliza May, he said, and her name and his voice sounded like something precious, something new. These past few days, they've meant more to me than you can possibly understand. She looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, and felt a dangerous, terrifying flutter in her chest. She was a widow. She wore Thomas's ring. This was wrong. Mr. Gray, my friends call me Silas, he said softly. Silas. The name felt personal, intimate, too intimate. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not ready for... I know, he said, releasing her hand but not moving away. I'm not asking for anything you can't give. But that was the problem. She was starting to realize she might be willing to give him everything. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally worked up the courage to ask him directly. Silas, she said, her voice careful, what did you do before you started traveling? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. I was in business, he finally said, his voice measured. Cattle, mostly, did well enough. But I got tired of the life it required. Too much time thinking about money. Not enough time thinking about what makes life worth living. So you just walked away? Sometimes, he said, his eyes fixed on the flames. Walking away is the only honest thing to do. He was holding something back, something massive. She could feel it. The man sleeping on a pallet by her fire was a living, breathing mystery, wrapped in contradictions. An educated drifter, a poor man with a gold watch, a lonely heart who spoke of cattle empires. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, and she knew it. Looking into his storm-gray eyes, she had the terrifying feeling that she was already falling, and she didn't know if he would catch her or if he would let her shatter on the rocks below. The sixth day brought Martha Henderson, her arms full of sourdough bread and her eyes full of sharp-eyed curiosity. The moment she and her husband John saw Silas emerge from the barn, an easy strength in his stride, the questions began. Mr. Gray, John said, shaking Silas's hand. Eliza watched her neighbor's expression shift. John was a man who understood hard work and character, and something in Silas's grip, his direct gaze, clearly earned his respect. They all sat around the small kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken tension. When John mentioned a sick calf, Silas leaned forward, his interest genuine. What are the symptoms? He asked. The questions that followed were sharp, specific, and showed a staggering knowledge of cattle diseases. He suggested a remedy John had never heard of, explaining the veterinary science behind it with the calm authority of a man who managed thousands of head. John was visibly impressed. You've worked cattle before? Some, Silas said, his expression giving nothing away. Martha, meanwhile, was watching Eliza. You look better, dear, she said, her tone carefully neutral. More color in your cheeks. Then she lowered her voice. Of course people will talk. A widow woman, a strange man under her roof. Before Eliza could respond, Silas spoke, his voice quiet but laced with steel. Mrs. Barnes showed Christian charity to a man who would have died without it. Anyone who finds fault with that says more about their own character than hers. The rebuke was so sharp, so authoritative, it silenced the entire room. John Henderson nodded slowly, a look of deep respect in his eyes. After the Hendersons left, a new tension settled between Eliza and Silas. Martha's right, Eliza said, pacing the floor. I know how this looks. Are you asking me to leave? He asked, and she could hear the hurt beneath the controlled words. No! The word burst out of her, more forceful than she intended. No, I don't want you to leave. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small room. What's proper, Eliza May, is that you saved a man's life. What's proper is that I'm trying to repay that kindness. What's not proper is small-minded people judging a good woman for having a good heart. His fierce defense of her honor left her breathless. It also left her more confused than ever. This was not the talk of a humble drifter. This was the voice of a man used to being obeyed, a man used to setting the terms. The next day, the seventh since his arrival, dawned clear and bright. The air was so crisp it ached in her lungs. Walk the property with me, he said, his eyes lighter than she'd ever seen them. Show me those apple tree spots Thomas marked. The suggestion was intimate, a step across a line she knew they shouldn't cross. But she found herself nodding, her heart thrumming a dangerous rhythm. They walked the snowy fields, their boots crunching in the silence. "Tell me about your plans for this place," he said, his gaze sweeping over the valley. Not Thomas's plans, yours. No one had ever asked her that. It had always been Thomas's dream, and she was just a part of it. I I never thought I was allowed to have my own," she admitted. "But now, I think maybe I'd do things differently. Stay small. Focus on quality, not quantity. Maybe, maybe breed horses, like I always wanted." "Smart," he said, nodding. "The big operations can produce quantity, but there's always a market for quality. Takes more knowledge, more patience, but the rewards are better." Again he spoke with the casual expertise of a business tycoon, not a man looking for his next meal. They reached the stakes Thomas had planted. She brushed the snow off one, her fingers tracing the rough wood. "Thomas thought teaching was a waste of time for a farmer's wife. But I loved it. I miss it." She looked at him, half expecting him to agree with Thomas. Instead, his expression was serious, almost pained. "A marriage should add to who you are," he said softly, "not subtract from it." The simple words struck her with the force of a physical blow. How much of herself had she packed away to be a good wife? "Is that why you never married?" she asked. He turned to face her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Partly. I realized I'd been trying so hard to be what my fiancée, Margaret, wanted. I'd lost track of who I actually was. Being here, with you, it's helped me remember." They stood there surrounded by the vast white silence of the Montana winter, and the space between them crackled with unspoken energy. He stepped closer, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. He reached up and cupped her cheek with his gloved hand. "Eliza May," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "these days with you have been the most real I've felt in years." And then he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, a hesitant question, but she rose up to meet him, and the kiss deepened, becoming something desperate and hungry and full of a longing that stunned them both. When they finally broke apart, she was trembling. "We shouldn't have done that," he said, though he made no move to step away. "No," she whispered, her fingers touching her lips. "We shouldn't have." But neither of them moved, and when he kissed her again, she kissed him back with all the pent-up loneliness and burgeoning hope in her heart. The walk back to the house was a blur of charged glances and accidental touches that sent sparks through her veins. A part of her was screaming warnings. He was a stranger. She was a grieving widow. But a deeper part, a part that had been frozen for months, was beginning to thaw. That night she reread Thomas's letters, searching for the comfort they used to bring. But the words felt like they belonged to another woman, another life. The woman Thomas had loved was safe and predictable. The woman Silas was awakening felt bigger, more alive, more herself. But as she lay in bed, listening to the sound of his breathing by the fire, one question hammered at her, louder and more insistent than ever. Who was Silas Gray? And could she build a future with a man who was still a ghost? The eighth day brought Harold Peaton from the bank. He didn't come alone. Flanking him were two men with cold eyes and guns strapped to their hips. Intimidation was the clear message. Eliza's stomach plummeted. She'd been dreading this. "Mrs. Barnes," Peaton said, his voice slick with false sympathy as he dismounted, "we need to discuss your situation." She led them into the house, Silas emerging from the barn to stand like a silent sentinel on the porch. His presence was a comfort, but she knew it was a fight he couldn't win for her. "I'll be direct," Peaton said, settling into Thomas's chair without being invited. "Your mortgage payment is more than a month overdue. The bank has been patient, but sentiment doesn't pay debts. You owe $340. The number felt like a death sentence, an impossible sum. "If I could just have until spring." "Spring won't change your situation." Peaton cut her off. "A woman alone cannot work this land. The sensible thing is to sell." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "I happen to represent interests who are willing to take this burden off your hands. They're prepared to offer you $400 for everything." The offer was an insult, Robbery. The land and improvements were worth 3, maybe 4 times that. That's outrageous, she said, her voice tight with anger. That's reality, Peyton sneered. She's not alone, Silas said from the doorway. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. Peyton's eyes narrowed, taking in Silas's worn clothes, his calm demeanor. And you are? A new partner, perhaps? The bank would require substantial proof of financial capacity before. I'm a friend, Silas said, his gaze locked on Peyton. And I'm advising Mrs. Barnes that she deserves time to consider her options. Time is a luxury she doesn't have, Peyton snapped, standing up. You have 2 weeks. Pay the debt in full or accept the offer. After that, we foreclose. After they rode away, a heavy silence filled the cabin. Eliza sank into her chair, the world tilting around her. 2 weeks. It was impossible. Maybe he's right, she whispered, the fight draining out of her. Maybe I should just let it go. Silas knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle but firm. Is that what you want? She looked around the room Thomas had built, every log a testament to their shared dream. No, she said, a sob catching in her throat. This is my home. Then we'll find a way, he said, his voice filled with a strange, unwavering certainty. We? She looked at him, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. Silas, this isn't your fight. You don't have that kind of money. His expression grew complex, a flicker of some deep internal conflict crossing his features. He took her hands in his. It became my fight the moment I started caring about you, he said. Trust me, Eliza May. I will not let them take your home. His confidence was both a comfort and a puzzle. How could a traveling man speak with such authority? Where would he get that kind of money? That night, as they shared a silent supper, she had to ask, Silas, when you said there might be ways, what did you mean? He set down his fork, his gray eyes meeting hers. I meant, he said slowly, that sometimes a man keeps his cards close to his chest until he's sure the game is worth playing. What kind of cards? The kind that matter, he said, his voice maddeningly vague, when they're used for something important. He was hiding something, something enormous. The feeling was no longer a suspicion, it was a certainty. His knowledge, his possessions, his strange confidence, they all pointed to a life he was deliberately concealing. And with only 2 weeks to save her home, she was terrified that the truth, whatever it was about to come out. She just didn't realize that when it did, it wouldn't just solve her problems. It would destroy her. The next day, Silas was gone before she woke. A note on the table, written in a surprisingly elegant script, simply said he'd ridden to town on business and would be back by nightfall. Business? What business could he possibly have? The house felt empty, the silence pressing in on her. The weight of Peyton's threat settled on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating. Hours crawled by. The winter sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. Still no Silas. Then she heard a horse. Her heart leaped, but it wasn't him. It was young Billy Henshaw from the general store, his face red from the cold and pinched with worry. Mrs. Barnes, he said, twisting his hat in his hands. Mr. Miller sent me. There's been talk in town about your Mr. Gray. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. What kind of talk? He was asking questions, Billy stammered. About land prices? Who owns what? Asking like a man who knows big business? And old Pete Carson, he swears he's seen him before. Said he looks powerful familiar, but he can't place him. Says he's no drifter. After Billy left, she paced the floor like a caged animal. He was lying. Everything was a lie. But why? It was full dark when he finally returned. He dismounted slowly, like a man carrying a heavy burden. When he stepped into the lamplight, she saw the exhaustion and conflict etched on his face. You were asking questions in town, she said, her voice flat. There was no point in pretending. About land, about ownership. What aren't you telling me, Silas? He braced his hands against the stone mantel of the fireplace, his back to her. I was afraid, he said, his voice rough. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently, treat me differently, try me. He turned, and the raw honesty in his eyes was like a punch to the gut. I'm not who you think I am, Eliza May. I'm not a traveling man. I have Resources. Significant resources. The admission hung in the air between them. You've been lying to me. Not lying, he said desperately. Just not telling you everything. It's the same thing. Anger, hot and sharp, flared in her chest. I trusted you. I let you into my home, my life, my heart. You've been playing some kind of game with me. It was never a game. His voice rose to match hers. What I feel for you is real. More real than anything I've felt in years. How can I believe that when you won't even tell me who you are? He let out a long, shuddering breath. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. My name is Silas Gray. That part is true. He paused, swallowing hard as if the next words were poison. But I'm not a drifter. I own the largest cattle operation in the Montana Territory. The world stopped. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. But the only thing Eliza could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The watch, the educated speech, the knowledge of cattle, the confidence. You're rich, she breathed. Yes. How rich? Rich enough, he said, his voice laced with pain, that your $340 debt wouldn't even register as an expense. The betrayal was absolute. It crashed over her in a sickening wave. He could have helped her at any moment. He could have ended her suffering with a simple word. Instead, he had watched her. He had let her worry, let her despair, let her fall for him, all while knowing her entire crisis was a meaningless sum to him. He had held all the power, and he had said nothing. Get out, she said, the words flat and dead in the suddenly cold room. Eliza May, please. Get out of my house. She turned away, unable to look at the face of the man who had so completely deceived her. The man she had, against all reason, started to love. Let me explain. Explain what? She whirled back, tears of rage and hurt streaming down her face. How you enjoyed playing at being poor. Did you find my struggle amusing? Did you think it was some kind of romantic adventure? No, I came here to escape my life, to escape people who only saw my money. You saw me. Just a man. Do you have any idea how precious that was? So you lied. You let me fall in love with a man who doesn't even exist. The words were out before she could stop them. A raw, bleeding confession. His face crumpled. He does exist, Eliza May. The man who's been here with you. The man who loves you. That's the real me. The money is just what I have. It's not who I am. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio, shoving documents at her. Deeds, bank papers, business agreements, all bearing his name, all detailing an empire so vast it made her head spin. The proof was undeniable, and it made the lie even worse. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, the fight gone, replaced by a hollow ache. Because for the first time in my life, his voice broke. Someone cared for me, not for my money, for me. And I was a coward. I was afraid to lose that. She looked at the powerful, wealthy man before her, and for the first time she saw the truth. He was terrified, but it wasn't enough. The wound was too deep. I need you to leave, Silas, she said, her voice barely audible. I need time. How much time? She couldn't look at the hope in his eyes. It was too painful. Maybe forever. She heard him gather his few things. She heard the soft click of the door closing behind him. She heard the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the night. Only then did she collapse into a chair and sob, not just for her home, but for the man she had loved and lost in the very same moment. He hadn't just been hiding his wealth. He had been hiding a secret far bigger than that. And the truth was about to ride back into her life with the force of a stampede. For 3 days, the silence in the cabin was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Eliza moved like a ghost through her chores, her heart a hollow cavern where love and trust used to be. Every corner of the house held a memory of him, his low voice by the fire, his easy laughter, the feel of his hand in hers. She understood his fear of being wanted only for his money, but understanding couldn't heal the gaping wound of his deception. On the 4th morning, horses approached. Her heart gave a stupid, hopeful leap, but it wasn't Silas. It was Harold Peaton, and this time, his thugs looked like they meant business. "Mrs. Barnes," Peaton called, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I trust you've considered our offer. My clients have grown impatient. They've authorized me to increase it to $450, but you signed today." "I have 5 more days," she said, lifting her chin, her voice steadier than she felt. "Circumstances have changed," Peaton said coolly. "We're proceeding with foreclosure. Immediately." One of his men spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow, his eyes lingering on her with chilling intent. "Awful isolated out here for a woman alone," the man drawled. "Accidents happen. Fires mostly. Terrible thing." The threat was unmistakable. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. Peaton held out the sales documents. "Sign them, Mrs. Barnes. Take the money. Be done with it." Before she could answer, another sound filled the air. A sound like rolling thunder. The thunder of hoofbeats. Dozens of them. They all turned. A small army of riders was cresting the hill, moving at a full gallop with the grim purpose of a cavalry charge. At their head, on a powerful black stallion, was a figure she recognized instantly. Silas. He rode not as a drifter, but as a commander. His face was a mask of cold fury. The dozen men behind him were armed, professional, and moved with a silent efficiency that was terrifying to behold. "Peaton," Silas said, his voice ringing with an authority that made the banker flinch. "You're trespassing. This is business between the bank and Mrs. Barnes." Peaton blustered. "No," Silas said, dismounting with fluid grace. He was no longer the quiet stranger. He was Silas Gray, the cattle king, and he radiated power. "This business is between you and me. It always has been." One of his men unrolled a massive survey map with a flourish. Eliza gasped. It showed the entire valley. Her little homestead was a tiny square in the middle of a vast ocean of property, all of it marked with the same insignia: Gray Ranch Holdings. "You see, Peaton," Silas continued, his voice dangerously calm, "Mrs. Barnes's property sits right in the middle of my grazing land. The land her late husband filed a claim on was never available. It was already mine." Peaton's face went white. "That's impossible. We have a clear title." A well-dressed man, clearly a lawyer, stepped forward from Silas's group. "You have a title based on a fraudulent claim, processed by a clerk who failed to check existing ownership records. The bank is attempting to foreclose on property that was never legally owned by the debtor." The world tilted. Her land, the home she and Thomas had poured their blood and sweat into, it had belonged to Silas all along. "Furthermore," Silas said, his eyes boring into Peaton, "I know all about your scheme, using your position at the bank to create financial crises, forcing homesteaders to sell cheap." Another of his men produced a thick file. "Contracts, letters, proof. You've been running a land grab, Peaton, and I know who you've been selling to." "You're creating false emergencies to drive people out," Eliza breathed, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Peaton's silence was a confession. One of his thugs made a fatal mistake, his hand twitching toward his gun. In a heartbeat, he was facing a dozen cocked rifles. "I'd advise against that," Silas said mildly. But Eliza barely heard him. She was staring at Silas, her mind reeling from the new, even bigger deception. "You've owned this land all along?" she whispered. He turned to her, and the anger on his face was replaced by a deep, aching pain. "Yes." "We've been living on your property for 3 years?" "Yes." "Why?" The word was a broken sob. "Why didn't you throw us off?" "Because Thomas was a good man trying to build a life. Because this valley was big enough for one small homestead," he said, his voice dropping. "And because, Eliza May, even before I met you, I admired what you two were building here." He took a step closer. "When I found out what Peaton was doing, I spent the last 3 days uncovering his entire operation. I wasn't going to let anyone take your home. Not him. Not anyone." "Because you own it," she said, the words bitter. "No," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "Because you belong here. This land might be mine by law, but it's yours in every way that matters." The revelations were too much. A wealthy benefactor, a secret landlord. It was a lie built on top of a lie. If you own all this, she asked, her voice shaking, why were you traveling alone? Why did you end up half dead in my barn? Silas dismissed his men with a flick of his wrist. They retreated, leaving the two of them alone in the suddenly quiet yard. Because I was running away, he said, a soul-deep weariness in his voice. From the business, from the responsibilities, from a life where everyone wants something from you. I came out here to find out who I was without the money and the power. He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes pleading for understanding. And I found him, right here, with you. For a moment she saw him not as the cattle king, but as the lonely man from the fire. The man who was desperate to be seen for who he was, not what he owned. But then, his lawyer stepped forward again, holding another document. Mr. Gray, the lawyer said, his expression grim, there's one more thing Mrs. Barnes needs to know. It's about her late husband. It's from his journal. Silas's face hardened. Not now. She has to know the whole truth, the lawyer insisted, handing Eliza a small leather-bound book. She opened it. The entry was from the week before Thomas died. His familiar handwriting swam before her eyes. The surveyor confirmed my fears today. The claim is faulty. We are on Gray Ranch land. I don't know how to tell Eliza May. She has sacrificed so much. To admit I failed, that this was all for nothing. I can't. I will find a way to buy it. I must. The ground beneath her feet gave way. It wasn't just Silas. Thomas had lied too. Her sainted husband had built their entire life on a foundation of deceit, too proud to admit his mistake. Her whole life, her entire marriage had been a lie. And the only man telling her the truth now was the one she'd just thrown out for doing the exact same thing. The revelations of that day shattered Eliza's world, grinding the pieces into dust. Thomas, her honest, hard-working husband, had knowingly built their life on another man's land. Silas, the deceitful stranger, had not only protected her home, but had also protected her from the painful truth about the man she had mourned. She was adrift in a sea of lies. The next morning, Silas's lawyer, a kind-faced man named Edward Morrison, returned alone. Mrs. Barnes, he said gently, Mr. Gray instructed me to deliver this. He handed her a thick sheaf of legal documents. It was a deed. Silas was giving her the 160 acres free and clear, but there was more. Tucked inside was a bank draft, a settlement, Morrison called it, for improvements made and emotional distress caused. The number on the draft made her gasp. It was more money than she could imagine, more than enough to be secure for the rest of her life. I can't accept this, she whispered. Mr. Gray was very clear, Morrison said. He said this makes you equals. He said no one could ever accuse you of wanting his money because now you have your own. His professional demeanor softened. In 15 years of working for him, I have never seen him do anything like this. This isn't business, Mrs. Barnes. This is his heart. After he left, Eliza stared at the papers that made her a wealthy, independent woman. Silas wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness. He was trying to earn her trust. By giving her everything, he had removed money from the equation entirely. If she came to him now, it would be for him alone. Later that day, sorting through a box of Thomas's papers, she found something Silas had left behind in his hasty departure. It was his will. Curiosity overriding her grief, she unfolded it. It was a cold, businesslike document, dated just 2 months before he'd stumbled into her barn. It detailed the distribution of his massive fortune to various charities and associates. But what struck her was the absence of people. No wife, no children, no family. The richest man in Montana was utterly alone. Pinned to the will was a personal letter to his lawyer. Edward, it began, I have built an empire, but forgotten to build a life. I cannot remember the last time I had a genuine conversation with another human being who didn't want something from me. I am going away. I'm going to travel as a common man. I need to know if anyone could care for Silas the man, not Silas Gray the cattle baron. I need to find out if I am capable of being loved for who I am, not what I have. Tears streamed down her face as she read the desperate, lonely words. This wasn't a game. It was a search. A desperate attempt by a man drowning in wealth to find something real. And he had found it in her little cabin. He had found her. That evening, a messenger arrived with a note in Silas's handwriting. Eliza May, I know you need time. I am returning to my ranch. The deed is yours no matter what you decide about us. That land belongs to you, and so does my heart. I will wait as long as it takes. Yours, Silas. Attached was a hand-drawn map to his ranch headquarters. At the bottom, he'd added a postscript. If you decide to come, ask for the man who loves you, not the man who owns the ranch. That night, she laid out the two sets of lies. Thomas's lie, born of pride and a desperate desire not to fail her, and Silas's lie, born of a deep, profound fear of never being truly loved. One man had tried to protect his pride. The other had tried to protect his heart. She thought of the deed that made her a landowner. She thought of the will that revealed his loneliness. She thought of the man who had defended her honor, saved her home, and loved her enough to set her free. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't just angry about his lies anymore. She was angry that a man like him had ever been made to feel that he had to lie to be loved at all. She hitched her wagon, packed a small bag, and for the first time in a long time, chose to ride toward an uncertain future instead of staying safe with her ghosts. The journey to the Gray Ranch took the better part of a day. As she crested the final hill and saw the headquarters spread out below, she finally understood the scale of his world. It was a kingdom of grass and cattle, stretching to the horizon. The main house was a grand but welcoming structure of stone and timber, surrounded by dozens of barns and outbuildings. A cowboy tipped his hat as she approached. "Ma'am?" She took a deep breath, her heart hammering. "I'm here to see the man who loves me." A slow grin spread across the man's weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. He's been expecting you. Said you'd find him in the small cabin down by the creek." She followed a winding path away from the bustle of the main ranch, her boots silent on the pine needles. The cabin, when she found it, was small and simple, built of weathered logs. It looked like the kind of place a man would go to remember who he was. He was in the doorway before she could knock, as if he'd been watching for her. He wore a simple flannel shirt, his feet bare despite the chill. He looked younger, less burdened. He just looked like Silas. "Eliza May," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "Hello, Silas," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She stepped inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. It felt more like him than the grand mansion on the hill ever could. "I spent my life earning money," he said, his voice quiet in the small space. "But I'd give it all away, every last cent, for another chance to earn your trust." "Silas," she said, turning to face him, "I need you to tell me the absolute truth about one thing." "Anything. If I had never found out who you were, would you have told me, eventually?" He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to craft the perfect answer. He just gave her the truth, raw and painful. "I don't know," he said, and she saw the agony the admission cost him. "I wanted to, every day, but I was a coward. I was so terrified of losing what we had that I risked it all with my silence." It was the answer she needed, not an excuse, but a confession. "Well," she said, closing the space between them, "I suppose we'll both have to be braver from now on." She reached into her pocket. She pulled out something small and circular. It wasn't her old wedding band. It was a new one, simple and unadorned, made of plain gold. The kind of ring a man could buy with honest wages. "I had this made in town," she said, her voice shaking just a little. "It's nothing fancy. It's a simple ring for a simple man." He stared at it as if it were a holy relic. "I'm not asking you to marry a wealthy landowner, Silas Gray," she said, her voice gaining strength, "because I'm one of those now, thanks to you." She took a deep breath. "I'm asking you to marry me. I'm proposing to Silas, the man who chopped my wood and mended my fences and listened to my stories. The man who made me laugh again. I don't care about the cattle king. I want the man." He sank to his knees before her, his big hands trembling as he reached for the ring. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because once I say yes, I'm never letting you go." "I'm sure," she said, placing the ring in his palm. "I'm hoping you'll come home with me, to my homestead." Our homestead, as my husband, as my partner. She gave him a watery smile. What do you say? Will you marry a woman stubborn enough to forgive you and crazy enough to think she can make you happy? He slipped the ring onto his own finger. It fit perfectly. Yes, he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken emotion. Yes, to everything. Yes. He rose and pulled her into his arms, and his kiss was not one of desperation or hunger, but of homecoming. It was the kiss of a man who had been lost and was finally, miraculously, found. 6 months later, they were married on the hillside overlooking the valley, right where Thomas's apple stake stood, now surrounded by the dozens of new saplings Silas had planted for their future. The whole community was there, celebrating the unlikely union of the quiet widow and the runaway cattle king. They had both been running from a life of loneliness. They had both been trapped by lies, his, hers, and the ones they had told themselves. But in a small, snowbound cabin, they had found a truth more powerful than any secret. That love wasn't about having the perfect life. It was about finding the perfect partner to share an imperfect one with. And as they stood hand in hand, looking out over the land that was now theirs together, they knew they had finally found their way home. If this story touched your heart, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We share incredible true stories of survival, love, and unexpected justice every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening.